Why would anyone admit to a crime they didn't commit? In 1515, the looming threat of the Iron Maiden forced many to confess to anything just to escape its horrors. Did torture truly extract confessions, or did it merely produce more victims? Let's dive into 20 medieval torture devices and decide if the legends are even more terrifying than we've heard. We begin with number 20, the rack. The rack was a slow, agonizing process that tore the human body apart. Victims were strapped down, their wrists and ankles fastened to opposite ends of a large wooden frame. The torturer would turn a crank, not quickly, but slowly, inch by painful inch. Ligaments snapped, shoulders dislocated, hips were pulled apart, ribs strained until they cracked. The sound wasn't just bones breaking, it was the sound of the human body unraveling. Blood loss was minimal, but the pain was immense. What made it even worse was that the torturer could stop at any time, only to start again. It didn't matter if you confessed or denied it. Either way, you would endure this torture until your body could stretch no more, sometimes growing by half a foot. Guy Fawkes, who was tortured on the rack in 1606, was so severely damaged that his signature became nothing more than a trembling scribble. The real horror was that the rack didn't always kill quickly, so you might even wake up in the middle of the next round of torment. Next up, number 19, the collar of spikes. This wasn't just a collar. It was a medieval device designed to slowly suffocate and torment the wearer. The collar was made of heavy iron, lined with spikes that faced inward, positioned to dig into the throat, jaw, and base of the skull. Once locked in place, every movement, every breath pushed the spikes deeper into the flesh. Victims could not lie down without being pierced by the spikes in their necks. Sleeping was impossible. Within days, the wounds would become infected, weakening the body and causing the mind to break long before the body did. Some prisoners in 15th century Germany were forced to wear these collars for weeks, with only brief intervals for interrogation, during which the true agony began. Sometimes they were left chained to walls or put in public stocks, where the crowds would mock them. The torture wasn't meant to kill quickly. It was meant to make you wish for death. Moving to number 18, the scavenger's daughter. This device didn't stretch you. Instead, it folded you into a position that felt like your body was about to snap. Created in 16th century England under the rule of Henry VIII, the scavenger's daughter was an iron frame shaped like the letter A. The victim was forced into a crouched position, knees pulled to the chest, head bent forward, and arms tightly bound. Once locked in, the frame applied immense pressure, forcing shallow breaths that felt like agony. The blood would rush to the head, causing eyes to bulge, while the strain on the muscles triggered painful spasms. Imagine being held in the same position for hours, sometimes days, with the excruciating pain building to a point where many would faint, only to regain consciousness and find themselves in even worse agony. Torturers favored this method because it left no visible broken bones, but rather inflicted deep internal trauma. Chroniclers recount that even noble prisoners in the Tower of London would collapse into unconsciousness after only a few minutes. In some cases, blood vessels under the skin would burst, causing faces to turn an awful shade of black and purple. It was the twisted opposite of the rack. This device didn't pull you apart. It forced you into a compressed, suffocating bowl of torment. Survival didn't mean escaping the pain. It meant living with torn muscles and joints that would be permanently damaged. Now at number 17, let's talk about burning at the stake. This was not just about flames. It was a gruesome spectacle, a combination of fear, public execution, and slow death. Burning at the stake was a punishment used widely across medieval Europe for crimes such as heresy, witchcraft, treason, and even moral offenses like sodomy. Public squares would fill with thousands of spectators, some even paying for the best vantage points. The condemned would be chained to a post, and often, green wood would be stacked around them to ensure the fire burned slowly, prolonging their suffering. Sometimes pitch or tar would be added to the fire, filling the air with smoke that would choke the victim's lungs before the flames ever touched their skin. Between 1555 and 1558, during the Marian persecutions in England, more than 280 Protestants were burned alive, some taking more than 30 minutes to die. In countries like Germany and France, some victims might be strangled first, but in other regions, they were left conscious for the entire process. Chroniclers described how the skin would blister, hair would catch fire, and eyes would burst from the extreme heat. The stench of burning flesh would haunt those in power for years. This wasn't just about punishment. It was a tool of propaganda, an unmistakable warning carved into the flames for anyone daring to challenge the authority of the crown or the church. Next, at number 16, we have pressing. This cruel method wasn't just about inflicting pain on the body, it was a method to crush a person's spirit. In medieval England and France, pressing was used mainly on accused criminals who refused to plead. This grisly tactic was an insidious legal loophole. Refusing to plead meant the accused couldn't be convicted, and their property would remain with their family. The victim would be stripped naked and placed on the ground, with a heavy board placed on their chest. Slowly, heavy stones, followed by massive iron slabs, would be added on top. The crushing weight caused ribs to snap like twigs, lungs to collapse, and eyes to bulge out of their sockets. Some victims endured this for days, each breath becoming a battle against hundreds of pounds of weight. In 1586, a Catholic martyr named Margaret Clitheroe died under 700 pounds of stone for sheltering priests. In 1692, during the colonial Salem witch trials, Giles Corey endured 2 days of pressing, refusing to plead guilty to witchcraft. His last words were, "More weight." Pressing was disguised as a form of legal procedure, a disturbing blend of physical pain, humiliation, and psychological warfare. Finally, at number 15, we have the crocodile shears. For those guilty of treason in late medieval Europe, execution wasn't just about ending their life, it was about making an example of them. The crocodile shears were iron tongs with serrated jaws, shaped like the mouth of a crocodile. Heated to a glowing red, they would be clamped around the offender's fingers, toes, or worse, their genitals. The teeth didn't just puncture the skin, they tore deep, ripping flesh and splintering bone in a single, agonizing motion. The first recorded use of this method was in 16th century France, designed for punishing those who killed kings. Similar devices later found their place in Germany and Italy, where they were employed against traitors and sexual offenders. One of the most infamous cases occurred in 1593, involving Francois Rouvillac, the assassin of King Henry IV of France. Before his execution by quartering, his body was publicly tortured with red-hot pincers. The goal wasn't merely to inflict pain, but to create a terrifying spectacle. The crowd could hear the searing of his flesh and his screams, blending with the sound of the executioner's hammering blows. Next, we move to number 14, strapado. If medieval torture had a signature sound, it would be the sickening crack of ligaments tearing apart. First recorded during the Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century, strapado became a notorious interrogation method across Europe. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and then a rope was looped around their wrists and hoisted over a high beam. With one sudden drop, the weight of the body would pull the shoulders out of their sockets, often on the very first tug. Some variations added sudden jerks or suspended weights to intensify the pain. Accounts from 1590s Rome describe prisoners fainting after only a few minutes, only to be revived and raised again until their bones pierced through their skin. The pain was so intense that it could lead to permanent paralysis or death from shock. The strapado wasn't kept in the shadows. In Florence, the Piazza della Signoria became a public stage where crowds gathered to watch victims' bones snap as they screamed confessions. Now, at number 13, we have the branks. If you thought medieval punishments were only about broken bones and bloodshed, think again. The branks, or scold's bridle, proved that psychological torture could be just as devastating. Emerging in Scotland in the 16th century, it was used against women accused of gossip, slander, or nagging their husbands. The device was an iron cage placed over the head, with a long flat plate forced into the mouth. This plate sometimes had sharp edges or spikes designed to tear the tongue and inner cheeks if the victim tried to speak. The true weapon here was public humiliation. Women would be paraded through town, the sound of the iron clanging as the crowd jeered and threw filth. Records from Newcastle in 1650 mentioned women being chained to a market post for hours, enduring rain and freezing winds. It didn't leave fatal wounds, but the emotional scars and disfiguring injuries could last a lifetime. In many towns, the branks became a symbol: speak too much, and you might never speak again. At number 12, we have the gar. The gar was an execution method by slow strangulation, but it came with a brutal twist. Originating in medieval Spain, the garrote was a punishment that persisted into the late 19th century. The device itself was simple yet brutal, a sturdy chair with an iron collar mounted on a post. The condemned individual would be seated, and the collar would be locked around their neck. A screw or lever at the back would be slowly turned, gradually pressing a metal bolt into the victim's spine or throat. In its earliest form, the goal was suffocation and agonizing death as the condemned convulsed for minutes before finally succumbing. As time went on, particularly from the 17th to 19th century in Spain, more refined versions emerged. These incorporated a sharp point designed to immediately crush the cervical vertebrae when the screw was tightened. This method was used for a variety of crimes, from murder to high treason. In 1820, Spain executed Prime Minister Rafael del Riego by garrote for leading a rebellion. Public executions by garrote were attended by thousands, but the atmosphere was eerily silent compared to hangings or burnings. The true horror of this execution method lay in the psychological torment. The victim sat passively before their executioner, feeling the cold iron collar, knowing that the next twist of the screw could either slowly choke them or snap their neck in an instant. Next, at number 11, we have the pillory and stocks. These devices were more than just tools for public shaming. They were instruments of slow torture that could leave the victim maimed or even dead. Used extensively across Europe from the 13th to 19th centuries, these wooden structures confined a person's head, hands, or feet, forcing them to stay in position for hours, sometimes even days. In a busy marketplace, the condemned person became a living target. Crowds would throw rotten food, excrement, stones, and sometimes boiling liquids at them. Teeth would be knocked out, bones broken, and eyes blinded. In 1623, a man in London accused of fraud died in the pillory after a stone struck his skull. In colonial America, prolonged exposure to harsh winters or the scorching sun could lead to frostbite, heatstroke, or permanent joint damage. The victims were unable to eat, drink, or defend themselves from attacks by animals. There are accounts of stray dogs mauling helpless prisoners. Authorities claimed these punishments were non-lethal justice, but in reality, survival depended on the mercy or cruelty of the crowd. Sometimes, the real punishment wasn't the time spent in stocks but the violence inflicted by onlookers. Now, at number 10, we have the coffin torture. The coffin torture was exactly what it sounds like: an iron cage shaped to fit the human body, sometimes barely larger than the victim themselves. This method was employed in medieval Germany, France, and England, where the condemned were stripped naked, locked inside the cage, and displayed in public squares. If execution was the intended outcome, they would be left to starve, dehydrate, or freeze. In some of the more sadistic cases, executioners would smear the victims with honey to attract insects. Flies, wasps, and even rats would feast on their flesh for days. Chroniclers from the 14th and 15th centuries described the sight of corpses hanging in these cages for weeks, a horrific punishment meant to serve as both a deterrent and a warning to others. The image of the victim's ribs protruding, flesh rotting, was meant to stick in the minds of anyone contemplating similar crimes. The coffin wasn't intended for a quick death. Its true purpose was to turn the human body into a grotesque, slow-burning billboard of suffering. The victim would be trapped inside, a living display for all to see, as time dragged on in agony. On to number 9, the knee splitter. This was not a subtle instrument of pain. Imagine 2 sharp metal plates, each lined with multiple spikes, clamped tightly around the knee joint and then tightened further until the joint was shattered. Originating in the 16th century, this device was favored by the Spanish Inquisition but was also used in Italy, France, and the German states. It wasn't designed to kill the victim immediately. Rather, it was created to break the victim's ability to move, ensuring prolonged suffering. As the spikes burrowed into the flesh, they fractured the kneecap, tore ligaments, and ground the cartilage into pulp. Many victims were left unable to walk, often reduced to crawling. In some extreme cases, the device was used on elbows or shins to intensify the torment. Historical records recount instances where both knees were destroyed before even beginning the interrogation, ensuring the prisoner would never escape. A French account from 1620 describes a thief whose knees were reduced to the consistency of crushed stones after just 3 turns of the screw. No battlefield injury was ever this precise. This was deliberate destruction of the body's ability to move, ensuring that the victim would endure pain that lasted a lifetime. Next, at number 8, we have tarring and burning. If burning at the stake was the fire of hell, then tarring and burning was hellfire with a sticky twist. This punishment began at sea, where pirates, mutineers, and deserters were subjected to it as a public warning. The victim was stripped of their clothing and tied to a post. Then boiling tar heated to more than 200 degrees Celsius was poured or smeared onto the skin. The tar didn't just burn. It fused with the flesh, sealing in the heat and creating deep, blackened blisters. Finally, the victim was set alight, transforming them into a human torch. In some executions at sea, the body would be left to smolder, sending a horrifying message to any onlookers. Records from 17th century England describe entire crews being forced to watch as the burning flesh mingled with the stench of pitch. Unlike a swift execution, this was slow, theatrical, and inescapable. It was a sentence meant not only to end the life of the accused but to leave a lasting terror in the minds of anyone witnessing it, a chilling warning burned into their memory. Now at number 7 we have thumbscrews. Forget grand executions or massive instruments of death. Thumbscrews were torture in the palm of your hand. As small and effective as a book clasp, this small iron device was clamped over the victim's fingers or thumbs and tightened with a screw. With every turn, the metal would sink deeper, crushing bones, bursting nails, and tearing through flesh. Originating in 16th century Europe, the thumbscrew was used by inquisitors, jailers, and even pirates during interrogations. During the Scottish witch trials, victims' hands were pulverized until they could no longer hold a quill to sign a confession. Instead, they would leave behind a trembling X as their final mark. Some versions of this device targeted the toes, making standing itself excruciating. Others were designed with spikes inside, so each turn of the screw would puncture and tear the flesh. A skilled torturer could stretch the ordeal for hours, applying just enough pressure to incapacitate the victim without causing immediate death. Records from Germany in the 1620s recount thieves who begged for the gallows rather than endure another round of this torturous device. The thumbscrews were not meant for quick death but for slowly breaking the will of the victim until they gave in to the demands of their torturers. Next, at number 6, is the chair of nails. At first glance, this might look like an ordinary wooden chair, but upon closer inspection, you would see hundreds of iron spikes covering every surface: the seat, the back, the armrests, and even the footrest. The victim was stripped of their clothes and bound to the chair, their own body weight driving the spikes into their flesh. The earliest versions of this torture device date back to 15th century Germany, with some models containing more than 1,500 sharp points. These spikes were often heated to a glowing red before the victim was forced to sit down, transforming the torture into a horrific combination of impalement and burning. The torturer could keep the victim in this position for hours or even days. Tight leather straps ensured the victim couldn't shift to alleviate the pressure. Every slight movement pushed the spikes deeper into the body. Blood loss was slow but constant, wearing down the victim without killing them immediately. Records from Nuremberg in 1536 tell of thieves confessing within minutes of being subjected to this torture. Some would faint repeatedly from the blood loss. In certain cases, the torturers would combine this with foot whipping or branding to enhance the pain. This wasn't just a chair, it was a throne of agony. Now at number 5 we have the iron gag. Used across Europe from the 16th to 18th century, this punishment was designed to make even breathing unbearable. It consisted of a metal clamp or plate forced deep into the mouth, pressing the tongue down while a sharp edge dug into the roof of the mouth or the throat. The victim would be strapped in place with iron bands around the head, sometimes bolted to a wall or a post. Any movement of the jaw or attempt to breathe would cause the metal to scrape against tender flesh. Bleeding was common, and in some cases, the swelling of the tongue would block the airway, causing slow suffocation. The death that came was not immediate but agonizing, as the victim's breath became more and more difficult. In the 1720s in Saxony, thieves were paraded through towns wearing this device, drooling blood while crowds jeered. Inquisitors also used it during interrogations, knowing that the pain and inability to speak would break the resistance of the accused. The iron gag silenced more than just words, it crushed the spirit. Next, at number 4 we have the drunkard's cloak. In 17th century England, public drunkenness wasn't just punished with a fine, it was turned into an unforgettable humiliation. The drunkard's cloak was literally a beer barrel with holes cut for the head and arms. Offenders were forced into this barrel, the foul-smelling wood clamped around their torso, and then paraded through town while children threw mud and stones at them. In the records from Newcastle, 1655, it's noted that many individuals were punished in this manner, with some forced to walk for hours until they collapsed from exhaustion. In the cold winters, the damp wood froze against the skin, causing frostbite in warmer regions, like Spain and parts of Italy. The stench of spoiled beer, sweat, and human waste inside the barrel became unbearable, often causing the victim to vomit, trapped in that overwhelming smell. Sometimes, the walk itself was just the beginning. Offenders were confined in the cloak for days, unable to lie down, forced to sleep standing up. What started as a punishment meant to entertain the crowd often ended in dehydration or even death. It was humiliation weaponized, and it was shockingly effective. Next, at number 3, we have the Spanish tickler. This wasn't an agricultural tool, far from it. The Spanish tickler, also known as the cat's claw, was a vicious torture device disguised as a simple farm instrument. It resembled an iron rake with 3 to 4 curved, sharp prongs. Victims were often chained to walls or whipping posts, and then the claw was dragged across their bare skin, shredding muscle and tearing tendons. Records from the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th century show that this device was used on those accused of heresy, theft, and rebellion. The claws were frequently heated to a red-hot temperature, intensifying the agony as they tore into the flesh. The torture wasn't limited to the back alone. Executioners used it to rip at the face, chest, and even down to the bones and the limbs. Very few survived this device. Even if the victim somehow survived the blood loss, infection almost always followed. In some instances, the body was systematically dismantled, piece by piece, over the course of hours, all while a crowd watched. This wasn't about executing someone quickly. The Spanish tickler was about breaking a person in front of an audience. Now, at number 2 we have the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. This medieval execution method wasn't just about death. It was about destroying the human body in front of an onlooking crowd. Used across Europe from the 13th to 18th centuries, the victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs splayed out. The executioner would use an iron cudgel to smash the bones, starting with the legs and working upwards. Each strike would break one limb after another, as many as 8 to 10 bones before the fatal blow was dealt. In some cases, the executioner would leave the victim alive after the initial round of blows, weaving their broken body through the wheel's spokes and hoisting it high on a pole. Chroniclers describe these executions as marathons, lasting hours, sometimes even days, with onlookers placing bets on how long the condemned would survive. The wheel became a symbol of divine justice, depicted in art with both saints and criminals. This wasn't merely an execution, it was public theater, meant to leave a lasting impression for decades. Finally, at number 1, we have scaphism. If hell had a waiting room, it would be scaphism, originating from ancient Persia, but whispered about in medieval chronicles. This torturous method trapped the victim between 2 hollowed-out boats or planks, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. The executioners force-fed milk and honey to induce violent diarrhea, then smeared the exposed skin with more honey to attract insects. Helplessly bound, the victim would float on stagnant waters or a swamp. Flies, wasps, and ants would swarm the body, laying their eggs in open sores. Ancient accounts, such as those of King Artaxerxes II's enemies, claimed death could take anywhere from 7 to 14 days as the flesh rotted alive under the burning sun and relentless infestation. The smell alone was said to travel for miles. This wasn't just an execution, it was erasure. Each drawn-out moment stripped away the victim's dignity, sanity, and life, making scaphism one of the slowest, most gruesome forms of punishment in recorded history.